Hey guys, my name's Tanner Daniels. Welcome to episode 7 of CCU's tech training videos. Today we're going to talk a little bit about noise gates and expanders. All right, so let's talk noise gates and expanders. What's a noise gate? What's an expander? Let's start with noise gates. So, in its most basic format, a noise gate is a tool used by audio engineers to shrink the dynamic range of an input, similar to a compressor, except unlike a compressor, a noise gate actually attacks from the bottom side of a signal as compared to the top. So a compressor knees off the top of a signal that would come in. A noise gate cuts off the bottom of it. Let's talk about the four main parameters that you'll find on just about any noise gate. Maybe that'll help you get a better idea of how they work and how you can use them. So the four main parameters that you will find on any noise gate are, first, threshold, range, attack, and release. I'm sure you're noticing that a few of these parameters look similar to what you'll find on a compressor, and that's because they are the same parameters. They just work on a different tool in a slightly different way. So threshold, very similar to a compressor, is where you set the threshold based on like where you want that tool to begin working. So on a noise gate, you set the threshold where you want the gate to open and close at. For an example, let me draw a little graph here. So on the bottom we have time, and on the top, and on the y-axis we have amplitude. So let's model a bass drum signal. Obviously it's not going to overlap like that, but we have say at the top, near the top of the peak is -5, a little below that we have -15, a little below that we have -30. Let's say we set our threshold at like -5. So if you can see here, only just like a little portion of that peak is making it over the threshold. So basically what you're doing by setting the threshold that high is like, yes, this is the entire peak, and if there was no gate, you would hear that the whole sound. However, if you set the gate right there, you're only going to hear that top section of that peak. The gate is then going to cut off the rest of the signal, automatically silence it so that you're not hearing that. And that's good because you could have noise intermingled in between here. Maybe your snare drum's hitting a little less in between here like so, and you don't want to hear that. You just want to hear the bass drum coming through the bass drum channel. The noise gate is going to help you to filter out any of those sounds that you don't want to have anything to do with. So threshold, to define that, where the noise gate begins working. Pretty simple. All right, let's talk about range. So we talked a little bit about range, I think, on a different episode. I can't remember what exactly we were talking about, but just like in mathematics, range is your maximum minus your minimum. But in this, we're kind of talking about how much we're allowing the gate to work, if that makes sense. So if you think about a noise gate, a lot of people would explain it as kind of like an automatic mute switch. So anytime that signal drops below our threshold, it's just like hitting a mute button and filtering everything else out. You can't think about it that way. That's kind of like thinking of a gate with like a -infinity range. However, it is possible to adjust the range and only allow that gate to maybe take off 10 decibels or 5 decibels. In that case, you wouldn't be muting it because you would still be getting some audio coming through. It would just be at a much less level of, that's not the right way to say that. It would sound a lot quieter than the peaks that are punching through that gate. So range is basically the amount of gain reduction that you're allowing the noise gate to do. And that's super important. So for an example, say you want to put a noise gate on a tom because you're getting some cymbal bleed, and you don't want to totally take that that tom out of the mix in case your drummer was to play something light on it that might not bust through the gate. But you don't want to hear the cymbals as loud as they are coming through the toms because it's kind of throwing off your mix overall. So what you could do is set a noise gate on there that has like maybe a -10 or a -15 range. So anytime that tom is not being hit, purposefully, you're still going to hear it in the mix, but it's going to be it's going to be further back in the mix, -15 lower than it would be if you were punching over the top of that threshold. So it's a very, very useful tool for kind of shaping the way things sound overall. And then attack and release, and you guys know what these dudes look like. You see them on compressors. They work similarly, and it's basically you're shaping kind of the way that the gain reduction is flowing back and forth. So attack is basically, if you think about it, if nothing is going on, let's say, let's do a graph again. I like these. They help me to visualize. So on our y-axis is gain reduction, on our x-axis is time. And let's say the lower we are on the x-axis here, that's the more gain reduction that's happening. So that's the more we're taking away. If you think about it, if a gate is just sitting and there's no input signal coming in, it's literally just going to be dragging along the bottom here. It's going to be gain reducing that whole time. As soon as we have a peak jump up through here, basically we're going to have this gate is going to let go. So depending on how you set your attack time is how fast that gate is going to let go of its clamp. It's clamping down. And that can shape the timbre of your instrument. So if you have a bass drum or a snare drum or a tom, and you have a very slow attack time, some of that initial peak might not make it through because it's going to take a second for that gate to open because it's going to be very lethargic. However, if it's very quick, then it'll be able to keep up with that peak that's coming in very fast. And similarly to a compressor, you can kind of shape what's called the transients of an instrument using a noise gate and get some pretty interesting effects. What you're usually going for is a very natural sounding. You kind of match the natural, ebb and flow of an input. So it's good to solo those things out or let that person solo that when you're sound checking so that you can kind of make sure that that gate is adjusted if you decide to use one. Release time is basically after the peak has then decreased and gone back below your threshold, how long it takes for your maximum gain reduction to reoccur. So attack, how fast the gate lets go, and then release, how long it takes to return to maximum gain reduction. And release is super, super important because it's very easy to make things sound very awkward and unnatural by making it like a very fast release time. So like say you have a tom and maybe you have a tom with like a single ply clear head on it, and so when you hit it, it has this very nice ring to it, like doom, as it kind of trails off. If you have a very fast release time, it's going to chop that off super quick and it's going to sound weird. So you're going to have doom, and as soon as it's like, as long as it's above the threshold, you'll be fine. But as soon as it drops below that threshold, if you have a fast release time, it's going to cut it off. So you're going to hear doom, doom, and it's going to cut it off instead of like this nice doom, kind of like trails. So on stuff like that, you're going to want a longer release time that kind of eases back into the gain reduction. So if you're trying to think of what that might sound like, say it's kind of like if someone were to hit a tom and then hit the mute button right away on it. It's just going to cut it off. As compared to if you hit the mute button and slowly ride a fader down, you're going to have that nice kind of trailing off gain reduction. And that's what's going to happen here. So that's noise gates. Let's talk briefly about expanders. They're similar to noise gates, except they have a slope. And basically what I mean by that is, so let's envision another graph here. We have input and output, and normally we would have this kind of linear relationship, just like we talked about in the compressor section. If we have 5 decibels in, we're getting 5 decibels out. If we have 20 decibels in, we're getting 20 decibels out. What happens on a noise gate is you actually get this drop off like this. So if I do this same signal, whoops, don't pay attention to that. If I do this same signal with a noise gate on it, it's right here. So let's say, okay, I set my noise gate at 20 dB. So at 25 dB right here, I'm getting 25 in and 25 out. But at 15 dB, I'm getting 15 in, but I'm getting nothing out because the noise gate has closed, if that makes sense. That's how a noise gate works. A expander has this nice like slope off to it. So if you see here, it's not a linear relationship necessarily. If I were to replicate it on this, it would kind of knee off like this. What happens is instead of like a direct, like, okay, you drop below this threshold, you're gone, like you're done. And expander has a sloping off of it. So maybe at 10 decibels in, I'm only getting 8 decibels out, if that makes sense. It's almost like kneeing on a compressor on the back side of an input, and that's super nice because it sounds more natural, if that makes sense to you at all. So a bass drum, the reason that we keep using drums here is because noise gates and expanders are used mostly on drums because that's mostly what you're gating to get any of that excess noise that you don't need out of those signals. On a bass drum, I prefer using an expander actually. As much as we would all like for a drummer to hit the bass drum the exact same time every time that they do it, they're not going to. And so we can even out that dynamic somewhat with a compressor. But what about the low end? So say they're doing this build and they're hitting the bass drum just very softly. If you have a noise gate, you might not be getting high enough above the threshold for you to even hear that. But if you have an expander, it'll be quieter, much, much quieter, but it will still be in the mix. It'll just be sloped off. So I hope that makes sense to you. That's basically the main difference between noise gates and expanders. I hope you guys understand all of the parameters that you'll find on a noise gate. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line at tanner.daniels@ccuniversity. That's right. tanner.daniels@ccuniversity.edu. I hope you guys had an awesome holiday. I hope you're having an awesome new year, and good luck in classes that are starting right now. I hope to see you guys around campus. Thanks.